James, you want some water?
I'd love some with, yeah, grand, thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Sorry for the delay in starting. We are still waiting for one of our speakers, but I'm sure she'll be here very shortly. Before I hand you over to Lyse Doucet, who is chairing tonight's discussion, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting this evening's event and are filming it. Over to Lyse.
Welcome. Thank you so much for turning out on such a gorgeous summer evening. And I want to believe it is because you all care deeply about Syria, even though I suspect that you want to be right next to St. Mary's Hospital when the future king is born, just in case it happens tonight, so you can tell your grandchildren, well, I was there when it happened. At any rate, if you do harbor that secret motive, never mind. We'll do anything to get you to think more about Syria. Summer has come to London, and I don't need to tell any of you that it is absolutely wonderful. Summer has come to Syria, and it's absolutely dreadful and devastating. It is, of course, the Muslim holy month of fasting, and Syria is a predominantly Muslim country in a region where many Muslims are not just fasting and praying, but as you would all know, that the month of Ramadan is also a time of festivities and socializing and celebrating. There's not much. In fact, there's very little to celebrate in Syria. You may have seen the latest figures from the United Nations yesterday, and they're absolutely stunning. I had to keep looking at them and to ask, are these correct? 6,000 Syrians on average are fleeing their country every day into neighboring countries. 5,000 Syrians on average are dying every month. So a whole country is dying, a society, a whole way of life, a mosaic, to use the word, is being torn apart. So where is Syria going, and what can be done to try to rescue a situation? What is the answer? Is it more guns or less guns? Is it a ceasefire? Is a ceasefire possible? Will they ever talk? We'd like to hear from all of you. We have a fantastic panel tonight. We will be joined by Hala Diab, who is an award-winning screen director and a producer and the founder and director of Liberty Media, Syrian, who lives in Leicester. She's been delayed by the train. We're also joined by Anthony Lloyd, the award-winning roving correspondent for The Times, who's been 11 times in the last more than 2 years covering the crisis in Syria. So we're very glad that he's safely back with us, roving around Paddington instead. Patrick Coburn, you also know, been a Middle East correspondent since the late 70s, working first for the Financial Times, and now many of you will know his writing in The Independent, is recently also back from Syria on a trip which took him to Damascus, to Homs, and to Tartus. And last but not least, the man who made it to the front cover of Prospect magazine, although he hopes it doesn't sell very well inside Syria. The title is Britain's Folly in Syria, and he argues a very strong case about what should be done or not done in Syria. Freelance writer working for some of the world's best publications, The New Republic, Newsweek, and many others. And me, Lyse Doucet. I work for the BBC, and I also keep going back and forth to Syria. So we would have started with Hala, but she will join us. Let me start with you, James. Just give us a snapshot about where, from your last trip, from what you've been reading and hearing since then, where is Syria now from what you can see?
Well, I think a snapshot would start with the idea that the regime appears to be winning. That's the latest idea in the international media. And if it appears to be winning, I think that's partly because of fatigue within the country. It's also because of fragmentation within the military insurgency, which we know well by now. But it's also, I think, because of fear among the minorities and to a certain extent among Sunnis about what might be coming next. I think there's another reason why the regime appears to be winning. And this is something that I think Patrick agrees with me on, and we'll talk about in more depth. But it's also because we were so convinced by many in the international media and many politicians in the Gulf and the West that the regime was shortly about to lose, that the regime now appears to be winning, even though no one is really winning, and we're in stalemate. And I strongly believe that many of the people who persuaded us that the rebels were on the cusp of victory have blood on their hands, because many young men went out to battle thinking that they were just about to win because they saw those tape loop of images, and they were killed. In terms of where we are on the ground very quickly at the moment, just to set some scene, my feeling is that the regime forces are gaining ground in Homs. They're slowly expelling rebels from different neighborhoods. They may well be able to recapture the whole of Homs. But even if they do, their combined forces, which now include paramilitaries and the so-called national defense forces, I think even if they do recapture all of Homs, they won't be able to do so for very long. Baba Amr, for example, changes hands pretty regularly. There simply isn't enough regime forces for them to recapture the whole city, or at least without remaining pockets of rebel resistance. In terms of Aleppo, I think that the idea that the regime forces and Hezbollah were going to march on Aleppo, I think that has turned out to be something of a propaganda puff. Insofar as they do that, it will be much harder than anything they've done before. Aleppo is much closer to the Turkish border, the rebel supply routes are much better, and it's possible that Hezbollah, I think, is smart enough to know that it doesn't want to get even more bogged down in Syria than it already has. My feeling might be that the regime forces might simply hang back and wait for, or hope that the military insurgency, that kind of armed revolution might eat itself. You know, what we're seeing is in Aleppo, and what I saw is Free Syrian Army people torturing other Free Syrian Army people because they're perceived to be corrupt, and also slightly maverick, well, very maverick groups like the Islamic State of Iraq and freelance jihadis who seem to want to pick a squabble with everyone else, which sort of damages the reputation of the armed insurgency. That's my feeling on where things stand at the moment. Please.
Here's the Harling perspective. Patrick Coburn, you've just been back.
Sure, yeah. I'd reiterate what James said about the reporting of Syria. I think people get a skewed idea of what's happening there, because Syria, I think, has produced some of the best foreign reporting, but also some of the worst. The best, including some of those present here tonight, of sort of good eyewitness reporting in very dangerous circumstances. The worst, because I think at the beginning, and this is different from other wars, certainly that I've covered, maybe Libya is a bit the same, that at the beginning of this conflict, the idea of the citizen journalist, that YouTube video of the war was sort of taken somehow as being neutral. But actually it's not citizen journalists or citizen activists, it's citizen propagandists. Nothing wrong with that from their point of view, but it gave an impression early on that the government was on the edge of defeat. Not just to the general public, but lots of governments until really the beginning of this year thought Assad was going to go down at any time. You have a vacuum of information in Syria because the government won't give enough visas to people to come in. That tends to be filled with second and third hand reporting from Beirut, from Amman, from outside. Overall, I think the picture has been very sort of skewed. Surprising, I mean, in this day and age, but actually worse than other wars I've covered. I think on the ground, you know, at the moment there's a stalemate. The government is gaining ground, controls most of Damascus. And all these areas where they described fighting going on in Damascus and Homs, a lot of these are actually empty of civilians, but civilians very sensibly have fled, or the army has ordered them out. So you have these sort of strange situation of completely empty areas within Damascus and within Homs and in Aleppo. But I don't think the government will advance a bit, the rebels might advance a bit. I don't think either is going to win any conclusive victory. I don't think the people who support them are going to let the other side win. So I think we're facing a sort of long war. I mean, cutting very briefly to the chase, I don't think there's going to be successful negotiations. I think the best you could get in Syria is a ceasefire. Maybe you can do it in 2 hops to get to a ceasefire and then get to some negotiations. But I don't think you can get directly to negotiations. And until you have a ceasefire, you have what in Belfast we used to call the politics of the last atrocity. Everybody is so het up by what's happening that nobody can really talk about things until the level of violence is reduced. Thanks.
Thank you. Anthony?
I think one of the lasting images I had from this last time, which shows slightly, to me, the state of the war at the moment, was this street, El Kharaj Street in Bustan Qasir, an area in the southeast of Aleppo. It's a single long street, about 600 metres long. It's got barricades at both ends and a series of sort of chicane-like sandbag emplacements on the way down. It's surrounded on 3 sides by regime positions, and yet every day thousands of people commute to work from the rebel lines to the regime areas. It may be that they're students at university, it happens that their home is in the rebel areas, but universities in the regime areas. It may be that their place of work is in a government office. And it struck me, it's a long walk, it's a long commute. There's been between 300 and 500 people shot by snipers there in the months of this year alone. In every respect, to look at that street, you see a war zone. But what it is it's a war zone that has become normality for thousands and thousands of people. They call it the Rafah crossing in deference to the Palestinian situation and their crossing point to the outside world. Some of them call it the border. So for thousands of people, the war continues to be a horrible presence in their life, but it is one that is also normality. Following on from what the other two have said, I think after Al-Qusayr there was certainly in Damascus and with the regime a big feeling that the tide had turned. Having gone in since then, I think Aleppo would be a very, very different situation. It's a very big city. Those largely Sunni villages around Aleppo on all sides are now hotbeds of rage, weapons, cash, and a lot of fighters. I think the regime would find it very, very difficult to establish a bridgehead near Aleppo and fight its way back into the city in any meaningful way. That's not to say that the intervention of Hezbollah in a local place in Al-Qusayr has not proved decisive. It certainly did prove decisive in Al-Qusayr. I doubt that could be replicated further away from Lebanon. So in Aleppo, in the rebel-held areas, you see solidified, entrenched, in many cases literally entrenched front lines, resembling sort of the siege of Sarajevo, but slightly worse. Sharia courts ruling the city in the rebel-held areas, responsible for pretty much everything from the supply of water to the administration of property through to judicial matters. And you see a continuation of tension emerging between the various rebel groups, and particularly between the FSA and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, who have killed 2 FSA commanders in the last sort of 10 days. Now, whether that's a tension which is going to open further schism or whether it's going to be something that simmers away in the background, I don't know. So, in every respect, to me, in the north, Syria looked like a very bloody and violent stalemate. And the question which we'll examine later, of course, is now what happens in the international community, which could be nothing at all, but vis-a-vis the debate of whether we give the rebels more weapons, whether that's going to solve anything or not.
So both you and Patrick used the word stalemate. James came out and said, with your great fear, fragmentation, and frustration, but said the regime was winning. Would you, from where you looked at it, Anthony, would you say either side has the upper hand, has the balance, or it's simply ground down between the two?
The regime's had a better 2 months than it's had at any stage of the revolution so far. Up until this point, the traffic was fairly one way. And the retaking of Al-Qusayr by a Hezbollah-led, by all accounts, force was certainly significant. I think the greatest significance is it's going to make the regime even more intransigent towards negotiation. And also the involvement of Hezbollah could have regional ramifications for the Sunni-Shia tension. So it might be a double-edged sword. But in terms of winning the war, and I don't think that's possible. If you look at the demographics, it's not possible. You
So we're not
say,
winning the war, winning the current phase of the war, or the sense
the-
that they're winning.
no, there's no. I don't see any sense of winning. I mean, if you think very quickly, demographics quite a boring subject. Syria's population about 22 million, approximately 65 to 70% Sunni. Whether the difference being whether you take the Kurds into account or not. Now, if you think of how difficult the Americans found it to subdue a province like Al-Anbar in Iraq, with everything they had at their disposal, the concept, even allowing for the fact that many Sunni families are still with the regime, the concept that the regime may somehow recapture rebel areas and subdue that country now, given all the blood that has passed, is incredible. It will not happen.
But it's interesting how you mention that, because it's a reminder of just how quickly the situation on the ground, or at least the perception of the situation on the ground, which is just as important, shifts. Because months ago, pretty well every journalist was saying, rightly or wrongly, and Patrick has led us to think whether or not a lot of it is wrongly, was that the momentum was with the opposition, that it was just a matter of time. Patrick, you've recently been back to Homs.
Yeah. I was there last, I was there last December. I mean, last December the government position was still quite strong. I think it's taken sort of time for the outside world, and actually a lot of Syrians, to realize that actually the rebels weren't winning, or they weren't winning as fast as they thought they were. I think Qusair was kind of a psychological moment that suddenly people realized actually the government wasn't losing. The government's always held that road north from Damascus to Homs. They hold the road over to Tartus on the Mediterranean, and they've always held that. So I think that was more of a sort of psychological changing point at Qusair, but a very important one. I agree with Anthony. I think that both sides can make sort of little advances, little retreats. I doubt if they can do more. Sort of heavy fighting in cities like Aleppo, in any city, absorbs lots and lots of troops. It means heavy casualties. It means the benefit of having trained soldiers is reduced against sort of militia holed up in houses. What they seem to be doing in Damascus is encircling areas, putting checkpoints around them, ordering the civilian population out, and then sort of squeezing them, but not necessarily going in. Sometimes they go in. It's a sort of strange world of patchworks, fiefdoms. I was staying in Baba Amr in the Christian quarter in the old city, and we were being mortared from Jobar, which is a Sunni area, and about 2 or 3 kilometers away. Other places there are deals between the government and the local, whoever the local gunmen are. And I think that you might extend that, you might have more ceasefires around, but I can't see either side winning conclusively, and I can't see either side negotiating substantively. And I think that the back of the mind of each of the sides, they think that in certain circumstances they might win. That's one of the things that keeps this thing going. That the opposition think, given some things happening, they could get full-scale foreign intervention like Libya, except it have to be more than Libya. The government think, we've got strong backing from Russia, the Iranians, we're through the worst, we're going to win this. That's what's fueling that, one of the things that's fueling that at the moment.
And the talk of the war, the perceptions of the... I'm just going to... Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome, Hala. Hala Diab, all the way from Leicester.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. We'll let you catch your breath. And I was interested, James, you used the term propaganda puff for Aleppo, because we were there during the battle and the end of the Battle of Qusair, and then just saw how there was just such a psychological shift among the supporters of the regime, everything from ordinary shopkeepers to members of the intelligence community who said, yes, now we're, with the advantages with us, we have a great victory in Qusair, we're pressing forward, it's just a matter of time. And in fact, some of them said, because that was at the time when there were protests in Turkey, they said, and Erdogan doesn't have any more time now to think about Syria, so we're just going to take back the border, and wallahi, we've won the war, which of course was wishful thinking. But It does, but it does influence events on the ground. Even though you said you thought the balance, the advantage was with the regime now, they still have a hard time pushing back where the rebels have pushed forward.
Yes, and I didn't really want to say that the regime was winning, only that
yes,
it
they're
appeared
not
to be
losing,
winning,
perhaps,
because
yeah.
it previously had been seen to be losing. If we want to talk about regime fragmentation, it's a much more difficult issue, because you can track down any Free Syrian Army commander, and I have by phone or Skype. It's very difficult to get a real insight into the regime. But just to give you a flavour and maybe a story which might illuminate, about 3 or 4 days ago, 7 mediators who were backed in an initiative by the regime were killed on the way to sort out a problem between an Alawi village and a Sunni village. And I've done a bit of research on this, because there was all kinds of lead up to this in terms of an attack on a checkpoint, and then people were killed. And these mediators were themselves, even though they were in an initiative backed by a part of the regime, were killed by extremist Shabiha pro-regime paramilitary. So what I think you get a sense of there is the different wings of the regime, a sort of more liberal wing, if you like, and then another wing, or a sense in which maybe the regime itself is no longer able to fully control the paramilitaries that do its dirty work. And I think that to get some sense of where the regime might be headed, or the different elements involved in it, that might be quite useful. I mean, if I'm to look into the future, and I really don't have much faith in the sort of pantomime politics that you get in international diplomacy. And I think perhaps like Patrick, I might say that if Assad eventually is to go, given the weaknesses of the opposition, it might be because of something that happens in the higher echelons of the regime. It might be some backdoor deal with Russia. If there's any way to get rid of Assad, that seems to be the likely one.
Okay. Before I turn to Hala, just to get a sense, good to get a sense of what everyone here is thinking as you listen to our panelists. How many of you here share the view that the situation now in Syria is a stalemate? Do you want to just raise your hands? Does anyone think that the regime is winning? Does anyone think the opposition is winning? I won't ask you which side you wish will win. I'll let you keep that for yourself. Hala, we've had different sketches from 3 journalists to James Harkin, Patrick Coburn, and Anthony Lloyd, who've all been frequent visitors to Syria, about where they think the balance of forces and the initiative lies with. We're getting a situation of a patchwork of control across Syria, country, of course, being destroyed, and roughly a stalemate. Do you want to see how you see the situation as a Syrian who watches closely?
I think that looking at what's happening in Syria as who is going to win and who is going to lose is not actually the question. The real question is where is Syria going, and where we as Syrians are going, and that's very important. If we look at what's happening on the ground, there is military opposition. There's so weak political opposition. When the Syrian demonstration started in 2011 and people called for reform and a change, what is happening now do not visualize what people want. It's just a war between Shia and Sunni, between Alawite and Sunni, between Bashar Assad and the rebels who represent the Sunni Salafi, who are trying to protect Salafism and Sunni presence in the region. And here, I think that they killed the Syrian revolution. They killed what Syrians want. What someone like me, who aspire to see my country like in England or like France or like any really advanced country which works on democracy and civil rights, what we need to work now is how to end this conflict. It's not who is going to win, because we can talk here about who is going to win, and Bashar Assad can win, the rebels can win. That is not the question. That will not save Syria. We have at least now 4 million Syrians displaced, 1.4 outside Syria, 4.5 displaced inside internally. There are at least 90 or 100,000 people killed. And what we have to work now, and what the West have to work now, is to ceasefire, is to bring Assad and the opposition to the negotiation table, and also to find strategies and ways to contain violence and extremism that's happening in Syria. We are looking at the situation in a very sophisticated, actually, salon talks. But what's happening on the ground is really horrible. In Raqqa and in Hama and in Aleppo, Jabhat al-Nusra, which Al-Qaeda groups, are in control of these countries. Yesterday only, and I'm saying that out of research because I'm writing on what's happening in Syria, and I have a Syrian drama which is now broadcast during Ramadan about what's happening in Syria. And there are places in Aleppo which are controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra. Women are forced to wear hijab in Aleppo. A 15-year-old child was killed a few weeks ago, Muhammad al-Qata, in Aleppo, because they said he offended Prophet Muhammad. And even the Free Syrian Army general was killed by Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, as intellectuals, as activists, as people who really care what's happening in Syria, we need to find ways to facilitate Geneva II, and the West should work harder on bring the opposition and the regime into negotiation. And that's how I see the situation.
And what about the other
in Syria.
side, though? Because, of course, there is mounting concern, and I'll ask how much you've met that on the ground, the growing presence of foreign jihadis from too many countries.
Yeah, but these jihadis do not represent Syria. I mean, Syrian...
But then there's also concern that Hezbollah has now publicly joined the fight, and so there are powerful backers.
And so are Saudi and Qatar
Yeah.
supporting the opposition, sending arms to the opposition.
So in other words, but all the foreign players have to push their allies to the table.
Of course, and this third party, which is intruder. I mean, these jihadis, Arab fighters are intruder. We have fighters from Libya, from Egypt, from Saudi Arabia, from Iraq, thugs from, I don't know from which country, Salafist, terrorist, jihadists coming from Europe, from England to fight and to get Jannah by fighting in Syria. And that's all because of the propaganda of this. I mean, we always forget the muftis, the scholars. In 7th of June in Egypt, in Cairo, Mohammed Morsi, has held a forum of scholars to call for jihad from Egypt and send jihadists to Syria. And I think that was a turning point, actually, in Morsi.
But do you see that as because we were in Qusair and saw Hezbollah there, huge numbers of Hezbollah who were there.
But there were also Saudi fighters.
Yeah, but I'm just saying,
jihadist fighters. I mean that, of course, I'm not defending, I'm not a pro-Assad. I am against both sides. I'm against what's happening in Syria. But of course, there are people who are fighting. This is war.
Yeah.
So the only way to end this, we can't blame Hezbollah and we can't blame Qatar because both of them, they are fighting for their own interest in Syria. Now, see what's happened. Egypt, the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood falls. Libya is on the edge between secularism and Muslim Brotherhood. Iraq is in conflict. And that's why Syria now, for all of this conflicting parties, represent the future of what's going to happen in the region, which is be secular civil societies or Muslim Brotherhood. We can't only blame Hezbollah or blame Russia. We need to blame also Qatar. We need to blame Saudi Arabia because both of them escalate the conflict. Both of them hijack and they stole the aspiration of people like me as Syrian to help and push Syria to a more civil, democratic, free country.
No, but your comments underline that this is no longer just Syria's war. We talk about it as a proxy war, a new Cold War with Russia and America backing different sides. I mean, on the ground, James, have you seen it over the time you've gone there, that it has taken on more and more of a character of having a lot of foreign actors fighting?
Yes, I mean, I was in Aleppo City a couple of months ago and I saw some foreign jihadis and some indigenous jihadis. Can I first of all agree with something that Hala said and then slightly disagree? First of all, I think, to come back to Patrick's point, there's been an enormous weakness, I think, in the primitive understanding of this conflict in the international media. And one aspect of that really is a kind of constant, relentless focus on arms and military men. What you're saying is that the journalists, sitting in flak jackets, as sort of armchair generals. And that's all really they're interested in. And I have to say that, I was in Damascus in February 2012 on a civilian visa, and I attended, mosque demonstrations there, which went from mosque right through the streets of Kafr Sousa. Thousands of young people between 16 and 25, incredible professionalism, the most inspiring political activity I've ever seen in my life, and much more sophisticated than the kind of Tarquins and Jessicas of the kind of hand-wringing Occupy movement. So what you see from that, and when I got back, no one was remotely interested, and I spoke to an editor in the New York Times, and they said, we're only interested in the war story. And much as the war story is obviously interesting, I think there's a real danger that we disenfranchise ordinary Syrians who find themselves, sort of surplus to a story which is going on all around them and almost doesn't concern them at all. But the second thing I want to say, which is slightly different from what Hala said, is the idea of Nusra, I think, is a complicated one. And I'd like to, I suppose, disagree with Anthony too, to some extent. This new idea that there will be a war between Nusra and the Free Syrian Army, I don't think that there will. I don't think that the Free Syrian Army want to pick that fight. I think there's a difference. The only difference when I talk to Syrians in Syria about jihadis is they make a distinction between indigenous jihadis, Syrians, and foreigners. They quite like they hold their nose, that they'll take on the support of the indigenous Syrian jihadis. They very much mistrust the Iraqis. So in terms of any schism within the insurgency, I think there are two possibilities. And it won't be the Free Syrian Army taking on Nusra on our behalf. It's possible that Nusra might even try and discipline the Islamic State of Iraq and all the very nutty freelance jihadis that are running around the place. Another possibility, and I think this is quite important for people who want to arm the opposition, is that I think one reason why those Free Syrian Army commanders, at least one of them, were killed was because Nusra were convinced, the Islamic State of Iraq were convinced that in return for the delivery of small arms, these Free Syrian Army battalions, which are strongly connected to the Supreme Military Council, are going to be sending back intelligence on their activities. So it's possible that I think that rather than the Free Syrian Army clamping down on Nusra, Nusra might increasingly move against selected battalions of the Free Syrian Army, which are very close to the Supreme Military Council. And I think that's a real problem for people who want to arm the opposition, because you're in danger of creating another proxy in a war which is full of proxies.
I don't agree with you that's like Free Syrian Army and they will not, have problems with the jihadists, because the jihadists who came to Syria, they didn't come really to support the democratic civil society. They came there to establish the Islamic State. And we have done many interviews with jihadist Libyan who were injured and went to Libya. And when we asked them, why did you go to Syria? He said, because I want to establish Islamic States and because Bashar Assad is Alawite, not because they want democratic state. And that is the real problem. If tomorrow Bashar falls or his regime will fall, we need to deal with the bigger challenge, is that the battle between the fractions of the Free Syrian Army, the political opposition and the military opposition on the ground, because they will tell them, we fight on the ground, you were outside of Syria, and also between the Jabhat al-Nusra and between the Free Syrian Army. And that is what we have to think about. And that's why I always call in all my talks and media appearances, we need to strengthen the political opposition of Syria. Where are the potential future Syrian leaders? Where are the potential ministers? Where are the potential MPs? Where are the people who will stand? In 2014, the election of Bashar Assad will be done. Who will run for elections? Where are the political opposition? There is no defined...
Well, I'll tell you where they are in Damascus. They're in jail because, you see, what you say is true in one sense, but it's also true that the regime clearly thinks that the jihadi are very much to their advantage. It alienates Syrians, it alienates foreign powers. So it's noticeable in Damascus that they're not going after them, they're going after the soft opposition, the constitutional opposition, the people who meet in coffee shops. I sort of would meet people there who were quite convinced they were no danger to anybody. I thought they're very likely to end up in jail just by meeting me, because they're much more of a political threat to the government. Because the government knows that not just the outside world, but ordinary Syrians go home in the evening, if the internet is working, they watch YouTube of Jabhat al-Nusra or somebody chopping people's heads off. So however much they dislike Assad or are neutral about Assad, they think the alternative is even worse. So this is a big political plus for the government. But all the others who you were talking about who were demonstrating last year, in a sense, these are potentially a much worse political threat because they present an acceptable political alternative to a lot of Syrians.
or maybe we need really to empower the new voices of how Syria should be for the future. For 40 years, these political leaders you're talking about who were in jail or who tried to find a place in Syria, they failed. They disappointed us as a generation. They accept to be ruled by Assad for 50
I can't let you get away.
years.
They are in jail.
Not all of them. Arif Dalila and Michel Kilo, they are
No,
the
just
most
all-
leaders. They failed us as a generation. I want to say
they
that.
left now,
Yes, but I say the patriarchy and any dictator will not like wake up in the morning and he will be a dictator. We feed the dictatorship. We feed people to rule us. We feed injustice. And if these people who were in power, I mean, many defected ministers are now leaders in the opposition in Qatar. Where have they been? For 40, 50 years, they were actually nourishing their own lives with the regime, and now they turned their back on them. These people disappointed the Syrian people. These people should have stood when Bashar Assad was appointed as a president without election, and everybody in the parliament, in Syrian parliament, clapped for him instead of standing against him. We created a dictator called Bashar Assad because of our fear, and it's time now to empower and help Syrian people and Syrian youth to break free from fear, not by arms, not by force, but by intellect, by passion, and by determination,
But I
and
think
by
we can- yeah,
ability.
Please, I think,
But
I think
as-
we're probably all
yes,
agreed,
yes.
and many of us in the room,
Yeah.
and all agreed here on this podium, that a military victory for either side would be a catastrophic disaster in terms of retributive killings politically in the region. We do not want, I don't think anybody with a logical brain wants either the rebels to win or the regime to win. There has to be a negotiated settlement. So how do you get to that point? Well, doing nothing is one option. There are many places in the world where we could go, oh, it looks pretty ugly, let's not do anything about it. But why I think Syria is so important, and doing nothing is still an option, but there are all sorts of very, very important and pressing reasons to do with its location and its position in Shia, Sunni and other minority politics in that area. And also the fact that though we've been using the word stalemate, one thing that hasn't really, stalemate doesn't equal stagnation. There are the most appalling, unimaginable numbers of people getting killed or displaced, and torture and imprisonment is on a sort of industrial scale. It is getting worse, it is getting worse. Jordan's becoming destabilised, southern Turkey's becoming destabilised, Lebanon's becoming destabilised, Iraq's on the edge of another civil war by any interpretation. This place is a very serious place and is having a cataclysmic effect on the region, which logically suggests that we should want to do something. So I think the question is, what is that that doesn't get to either side winning, but might produce a negotiated settlement?
And I think it's very important, though, that we're tending to focus on two sides. That our impression is that actually there's a third side, which is the people caught in the middle. And our impression, I don't know whether you share it, is that actually it's growing bigger and bigger, that they look neither to Assad and his supporters nor to the rebels, and actually are completely frustrated because they don't know who to turn to anymore, and just really want a political settlement. They want the suffering to end. What can possibly be done? I just want to open it up to any questions. We will get into intervention or not intervention in a moment. But if you have any questions that have risen because of what has been said so far, please say who you are, unless you prefer to remain undercover.
Donald Davidson, well, a very important point. A month ago, Ronan Dumas, who was Mitterrand's foreign minister, he said on French TV, and you can look at it, everyone can look at it on the internet, and he was saying that he reckons that it was the English who stirred up the civil war 2 years ago. And that's what he said. And you could, yeah, the English did it. He's les Anglais. Well, that's what he said. And again, anyone can see this interview and the transcripts on the internet. So just like, I don't know, has anyone got any comments? Or anyone in the panel who's aware of what Mitterrand's Dumas' comments? And of course, I must say that 10 years ago he was involved in a very big corruption scandal, the Elf affair. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to get a few questions just to see what everyone's thinking.
Isn't the Arab Spring,
Name, please?
Matthew Robb, isn't the Arab Spring a bit of a fallacy and just a front for continued army stroke theological control, as can be seen in Egypt?
In the sense of what, that it's a way for the Islamists to...
Yeah, if you get rid of Assad, you'll get in another dictator, one we don't know whether we can work with, and just allows the fundamentalists in through the back door.
Okay. Any other? Here and here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Mary Johnson. I'm an international lawyer, and I'm part of a consortium of experts that's working on developing a transitional justice plan for the future Syria. And I wanted to ask possibly Anthony, possibly Hala, possibly everyone, if you see the possibility for the international community to support propping up of civil institutions, particularly in Aleppo, say beginning immediately, as an alternative to the Sharia court system and as a means of giving some more legitimacy to a governing organization that can plant the seed for future government.
Interesting. Okay. 1 second. Sorry, Simon? Just pass it down.
So, Simon, I work for the BBC. I'm really interested in the panel's views on, given the complexities of the Syrian story and the comments that you've made about the dangers of a sort of worm-eye tactical view of shoot, shoot, bang, bang, how does this unbelievably complex story get explained in a way that those who are interested in at least switching on their televisions or radios, how are they going to understand, how do we convey to them the complexities of the issues that you've been describing?
Okay. Patrick, do you want to take the British? I mean, it's a bit...
Good question.
Yes, there's many conspiracy theories, but your question underlines that this is not just about Syrian politics, it's about broader European and Cold War.
I think this was a genuine popular uprising to begin with, you know, for understandable reasons against a police state which had never been that popular. You know, was there foreign intervention? You bet.
With leaflets is really going to help at this point in terms of Syria's sort of transition to democracy. In terms of the French government, I mean, I don't really pay much attention to what the French government's saying, but my view on international intervention is, I think, different from what I see as a kind of predominant idea among the old left and the patrician right, who have exactly the same idea on Syria, and the idea that this is another Afghanistan. It's not another Afghanistan, even though it may look superficially similar because you have blokes with beards, with guns. But the difference is, in Afghanistan, we wanted the rebels to win. Now, we simply want them not to lose. That's hugely important. And what you get is a sense of betrayal among people who, as Patrick said, constantly thought that if they pushed things, they might get an intervention, and we simply vacillated. This kind of stop-go approach to international politics is in many ways just as damaging as things which have gone on in the past in terms of intervention.
Your point, you actually raised an important point, because the journalists have been visiting a part of Aleppo, and I think it's the largest part of Aleppo now that is under control of the opposition. I understand that on the 30% or so that's controlled by the government salaries are still being paid, and civil servants are going to work, but we never see that because no one gets access to those areas. It's so difficult. You can't fly there, and the road from Damascus to Aleppo is still quite dangerous. You had a reaction on that. Did you want to?
Because I don't agree with you when you say the international community should not help Syrian for.
No, I think humanitarian aid. It's just that I'm not sure that sort of.
It should. So they should
international
only
justice.
help them by arming, giving them arms.
No, I didn't say that either. But it's just.
I think that as a civilization, Arab civilization, we have lived for years and years within tribes. We are tribal people. We are not like, you know, kind of society. Even our religion, when Islam, we are followers of one leader who is Prophet Muhammad. So we as Arabs, or we as Muslim, have this kind of ideology of following a group. And I think that's through time and through the time we're going through, especially now with the young generation striving for a change and democracy, and also because of the cosmopolitan society we live now in the Middle East, especially in Syria. We have Shia, Sunni, Alawite, Armenians, Kurds. We are so diverse, and I think that we need international help in empowering Syrian youth for the civil society. And I see that it will help to raise the country than for Westerner to come to Syria and help the civilians. And I will tell you what is the tactic for that. It's through the displaced young people who are in Jordan, in Egypt, and in Lebanon. The majority of the Syrians who left Syria, they are well off, educated, and they can be a potential backbone of political opposition. And also, if we can get hold of these young people, train them through workshops, through programs about civil society, women's rights, minorities' rights, equal rights, religious diversity, through programs, through maybe visiting studies in USA and United Kingdom, and help these people, I think they can go
That's
back
being done
to
at the
Syria.
moment in Beirut, and it's simply not going to
No,
work.
it's not. It's not. I will
it's
tell
a,
you why.
It's
I'm
a sticking
working,
plaster.
I'm
Could I
working-
just come back on a couple of... Sorry, a couple of, because I think these are interesting points. I agree with you, but then you utterly disenfranchise the group, what seems to be the predominant group of young Syrians that I meet, who are Salafis. Now they make a distinction. They make a distinction between.
You interrupted me. I will tell you something.
Sorry.
I have family who is displaced in Lebanon, and I have friends, and the majority of my families and my relatives are in Egypt and in Lebanon and in Jordan. Most of young people, Syrians, if they don't have money to survive, they can't work. They don't allow them in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Egypt to work. Let's speak in a very frank way. And these people, they are graduated from Damascus University, which is one of the best universities in Middle East. And these are potential opposition. These are potential people who can create.
When you say opposition,
civil,
you mean opposition to who? To the government?
to the
opposition?
government, to create future
Okay, we
Syria.
understand, yes.
We say future
Could I-
Syria,
let's-
not opposition.
Okay, we understand.
We will not say opposition.
Okay.
We speak
Hala,
about the
could I-
That's fine.
civilians.
Okay, we don't want to get too.
We speak about the
Okay.
civilians.
There's a-
These
That's why
people.
we made
Yes,
the
yes,
point
yes.
about
Yeah.
civil. Yes, we want
Hala,
to
let
develop
me talk.
society. Let's
There's
move on to
a
the-
very simple trajectory taken by those incredibly impressive, intelligent young Syrians that you're talking about who are on demonstrations rather than here.
Not all of them demonstrated. Not all of them
And the
demonstrated
distinction is
Syria.
this: they start off as liberals, they end up as Salafis. Now that's not
No,
Salafist.
You speak about minority.
No,
I'm
I speak about
Syrian,
lots
and
of
I
young
know.
Syrians
We
that I
are
met.
not Salafi. As
Okay,
Syrian, we are moderate Muslims.
let's leave this for the moment. Anthony, could you raise? Simon wanted to know how to tell the story better. You are a accomplished
It's very
storyteller.
difficult.
Yeah.
Keep going back, and there's not many journalists who do go back, because it's a very difficult place to work for all sorts of reasons, particularly on the rebel side, the fear of getting abducted, which is a threat which is very difficult to mitigate against. I think by going back repeatedly, you have some sense of continuity and can project some nuance and finer detail in stories perhaps, but working for a British newspaper, you've got maybe 800 words to make your point. And for a readership who, you know, they're not going to be hugely fascinated beyond paragraph
what's your
3.
impression? Do people in the UK care?
Yeah, but I think people in the UK are blighted by the post-Iraq era. I mean,
exactly.
we're post-Iraq, almost post-Afghanistan, intervention's got a bad name, we don't want to send anyone to the Middle East, we don't really want to believe stories about chemical weapons being used because everyone got spun a line last time.
This particular problem, God, that's really pejorative, but Syria, when you compare it against, say, Afghanistan, and where Syria sits in sort of geopolitical terms, ought to have our attention, you know, kind of 110, 150%.
Absolutely, but we live in the context that we do.
How are we going to get over that hurdle?
Oh, I don't think we are.
Could I? Sorry.
But I still think there is interest in Britain, in many parts of the world. In Syria, certainly not a day goes by, sometimes not an hour goes by without someone speaking out against
And I
what's
think it's very
happening in
important to
Syria.
remember as a journalist as well that you report on the issue and the event and you judge yourself by that ability. You're not reporting to affect change. We can talk here on this podium what might happen or what could be done or give them weapons or don't or whatever, but at the end of the day the job's just to report it, and that's how you judge yourself. And if no one does anything and everyone says, God, your reports from Syria bore me, then you've still got to go back and carry on reporting, because that's what you do.
Well, I mean, that's a challenge to reporters to keep making.
Well, exactly. No, but it is. We're not judged by what changes we affect.
There's one
Could
quick comment
add a
and we're
little
gonna switch.
to what Anthony was saying. You know, the problem is you have this vacuum of information, partly the government's doing, about something that people, I think, genuinely are interested in. And it's tended to get filled by what strikes me by second and third hand information. When the last time I was in Syria, I went to one town called Tal Kalak, where Al Jazeera Arabic was reporting intense fighting was going on, smoke was rising over the town. I was actually at that very moment for 3 hours. No smoke, no fighting, cats asleep on doorsteps, completely untrue. But unless you're accidentally in these places, you can't prove that. So I think that Al Jazeera, which was such a great boost and to the whole Middle East at one time, has sort of partly created this mood of becoming a sort of propaganda outfit with some very good reporters, but basically a propaganda outfit. And I think just a lack of skepticism, BBC, just all the media, worse in America than Britain, about these sort of second and third-hand reports.
Well,
Can I, very briefly on, I think it's a wonderful question about story. I mean, the way I see it is, too often, perhaps because of our attention span and the tribalism of the media, the reporting of this is in terms of angels and demons. So rebel cannibals and government people who chop people's heads off with chainsaws, this sort of social media type reporting. But this, there aren't any Syrians who are demonic. There are some opportunists, there are some criminals, but, Syrians aren't demons in my experience. People have interests, and they defend those interests, often in gruesome ways because they're forced to. Now, the way to tell the story is very simple. This is a simple story about the decline of politics, which is why young, clever, intelligent men from the University of Damascus become Salafis as a sort of subcultural reaction, rather like British people become environmentalists because of the decline of traditional leftism. This is different from Salafism. This is what young people believe in because there's nothing else to believe in, because the left has collapsed.
It's still a minority in
Sorry?
Syria, though. The Salafis are still a minority, I would say.
As far as I can see, the Free Syrian Army is made up of middle-aged Nasserists and sort of secularists and young men with beards who consider themselves not Salafists, but Salafi. And what they mean by that is a direct relationship to God because they have no politics to believe in. This is a very familiar story about the decline of politics. It's a story about the decline of secularism. You could see Bashar al-Assad as a sort of gruesome Richard Dawkins, unable to a sort of fake secularism which has then collapsed. Now, these are very simple, familiar stories, and that's the way I think to talk about it.
There's still a large community in Syria with still hopes for a secular future of Syria. I think we don't have the figures to show.
Absolutely. I'm talking about the decline of a sort of fake authoritarian secularism, which is very important.
Now, as Anthony said, the job of journalists is to write about it, to report it, and sometimes I say, in fact, often I say, thank God I only have to write about it, because the task of putting Syria back on a path towards, as Anthony said, a negotiated settlement is a very rocky path indeed. I'm going to open it up now to say, do any of you want to offer some ideas about, we know the problems facing Geneva II. It was supposed to have been a few months ago. Now it's been pushed to September. There's still skepticism about whether either side is A, willing to go and be willing to negotiate seriously about a sharing of power, and B, about the military side, those who believe actually Assad will never come to the table unless he is forced to come to the table. Therefore, you've got to change the military balance. And those who believe, of course, that more guns mean more suffering for Syria, more devastation, better to make what has not been yet the case, a serious push, mainly in Washington and Russia, but in other capitals, including Middle Eastern capitals and Damascus, to get people to the table. Does anyone want to add?
If I could, I don't think you're going to get substantive negotiations. Assad will go to the table, but is he going to negotiate his own political disappearance? Well, no. Why should he? He controls 13 out of 14 provincial capitals. The opposition don't have anybody to go to the table anyway.
Because there's too many to go to the table.
Yeah, they're too disunited. So, how should you begin? Well, actually, you should begin with the outside powers, Russian Americans, having a ceasefire, just non-violence for a time. Then you might begin to get some sort of negotiations. If you want to have, when you have a war, everything changes. It's not how many people support you, it's how many people who are prepared to get killed who support you that really count. That's why the jihadi matter. It doesn't matter exactly, they don't have to be enormous in number, but they're prepared to fight very hard. As soon as you move away from armed conflict, then that advantage disappears. The politics, you do have politics beginning to reappear, but you don't really have it in war conditions.
But how can you be even saying that you can't get a unified command to go to a negotiating table? How can you get a unified command to agree to a ceasefire? I think it is so splintered now.
You can get there are ceasefires all over Syria in
some
different
local
areas.
ones in very specific circumstances.
But actually, over most of Damascus, there's some sort of ceasefire. In Homs, there are ceasefires.
Some tacit ones in some places.
Well, often the elaborate ones that have been negotiated. In some cases, the rebels have given up their weapons. Sometimes they say they give up, but obviously they haven't. The army isn't coming. It differs from place to place. So I think it is feasible with outside pressure. I think it's the only thing that's feasible.
Okay, Anthony, do you want to add something?
I'd say there's two pretty close run horses when it comes to arming and not arming. And I fully hear all the arguments of humanitarian concerns and a youthful, enlivened opposition, but I think we're in a state of a war which is more bitter and more enraged than any of us in this room can imagine. So I think you can argue a strong case, or I could, to say, okay, let's do all of that. Let's try and gel, unify and strengthen the opposition abroad. Let's simultaneously raise weapons supplies for selected groups of rebels. Looking back at a war like Bosnia, very different but similar in some ways, in that you had a dominant minority, a militarily dominant minority, the Serbs. You had no chance of meaningful negotiation between the Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims until the point when arms and training were given to the Bosnian Muslim government, allowing enough not to win the war, but allow them to plant in the Serb mind that the moment for military victory was lost to the Serbs. That they hadn't lost the war, they'd lost the chance to win the war. They'd also lost some territory. At that point, you had a fertile ground for Dayton, which was far from ideal, didn't satisfy anybody particularly, but did at least stop the war. I would argue that Syria, Humpty Dumpty's broken beyond repair. You're not going to get Syria back together again as it was. In order to get to a negotiation that has any chance of solving the war along an imperfect peace, then you're going to have to change the balance of power, and you're going to have to do that by starting arming selected rebel groups.
But if you want a game changer, to use the phrase, isn't it the case that you need not more guns and ammunition, you need sophisticated weaponry, you need surface-to-air missiles, you need, anti-armor missiles, you need the kind of significant, sophisticated, expensive weaponry that either the rebels don't know how to use yet, or Western powers who have them don't want to give it to them. And
if you want to do it, you can do it. We live 30 years beyond the debate of what happened to surface-to-air missiles that were given to the Mujahideen against the Soviets. Technology has increased massively. You will never get 100% sealed deal on the people you give weapons to. There will always be some leakage. However, if you want to, using Prometheus projects or whatever, give surface-to-air missiles to people that can only be, forget disabled, but enabled in specific circumstances, partnered with, friendly special forces groups like the Qataris or whatever, then you have a pretty good sense of control on those weapon systems. It's not perfect, but yes, you have to change the dynamics, particularly of air, as you did with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, but using better technology. I'm not saying it's a sealed deal, but it's, if you want to do it, you can do it.
Yeah. The best phrase I heard last time I last visit Damascus was to a cautionary tale. There were 6-7 groups of Mujahideen in Afghanistan. There are now, in the last count, 1,600 groups in Syria and counting. James?
To come back to something you said, Lyse, I think there are some fascinating vignettes about what's happening at local level in Syria, one of which is that the salaries are still being paid to rebels areas. The other is that, the rebels and the government are dealing over oil up in Raqqa. So at the same time, you have this propaganda on both sides that the other side are demonic and that they're all foreign and evil. People are dealing with one another. Now, my view is that Syria, not a single Syrian I've ever met wants to have a sort of Balkanized cut-up of their country. They don't want foreign map makers to come in and cut up their country. No one wants that. So why would you offer them the least worst scenario? It seems to me that that's just a recipe to keep the thing going. I think that if there's any progress to be made, it's going to be made at local level. It's going to be made along the lines of sort of freezing out foreign actors, as Patrick said. And I think, Syrians still bizarrely agree on more than we give them credit for. The Free Syrian Army thinks that it's being conned and used by foreign powers. Many in the regime are skeptical of their own international supporters. So I think, rather differently from Anthony, my view would be that some progress has to be made around the basis of the idea of Syria, which most Syrians still believe in, and that if they don't take action, then their country is going to be carved up by some kind of map maker in a foreign think tank, and that will be to the detriment of everyone.
I mean, that picture is the positive picture of Syria, the Syria that does exist. But what about the commanders who are bitterly accusing the West of betrayal, who say they want more weapons, and by hook or by crook, they'll get them. In fact, they are getting them. Qatar is sending them, the UAE is sending them. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think a good way to think about it, to come back to something I came back to earlier, was, those Shia villages around Aleppo, which are now, full of fighters, many involved with the Shabiha. But at various points in this uprising, there's been attempts, I think, by Kurds and occasionally by Christians to develop some kind of contacts between the Shia villages and the surrounding Sunni villages, which are now besieging them. And I think that the future has to lie in some kind of honest brokers on both sides. And I think here it's incredibly important that we think about the minorities, the Christians and the Druze, who are sort of sitting on the sidelines, who could be used as honest brokers outside of the regime purview, trying to develop relationships among ordinary Syrians. I think they really have to get off their arses at this point.
But name me one recent conflict as bitter as Syria, where honest brokers from a minority have come in and managed to achieve anything. I mean, I think we're well beyond that sort of opportunity in Syria, well beyond it.
Yeah, but Anthony, if more weapons come in for the rebels, this is now a regional conflict. More weapons will come in on the government side, or more men will be sent. They'll even it up.
On the government side already. They've been using chemical weapons, thermobaric devices, gunships, jets, and artillery right pretty much from the go.
I think that the only foreign intervention which really works is massive foreign intervention, which amounts to war, even more than, close to Iraq, more than Libya. I think the people who argue for intervention don't quite face the fact that if they're going to have an effective intervention, it has to be 100%. Anything less than that just prolongs the war.
And nobody is talking about that yet, certainly.
And nobody's talking about it.
Hala, you've heard, you nailed your colours to the mast early on by saying you believe that all sides had to go to the negotiating table at Geneva too, but you've heard now from our other panellists. Did you want to add something
yes,
to?
I think that any delegation from which includes Syrian leaders or Syrian opposition or Syrian people or Syrian organization, international organization, to pave the way before the Geneva. We can't just now tell the opposition and the regime, come to the Geneva too. I think they come to Geneva too to agree on what is the future of Syria, that Assad should go, transitional government, ceasefire, strategies to stop violence and control extremism on the ground. There should be from the West a negotiation delegation that should go to Damascus, to Bashar Assad, to speak to the government, that should go to the rebels, to Jabhat al-Nusra in Aleppo, should go to the opposition, to Salim Idris, should go to Libya, because Libya is sending the rebels and they should close the borders and stop sending jihadists, should go to King Saud in Saudi Arabia, should go to Russia, and should go to Iran before Geneva too.
And what should Russia do? Because you're focusing on what the West should do.
I mean, we see what in G8 Putin said. He said his main fear, he doesn't care about Assad, he cares about his interest in the region, and because it's his ally in the Middle East. If Russia knows there is a strong political opposition that will replace Assad, the moment Assad will fall or will resign or will go, there will be another strong, transitional, diverse, cohesive government. The Russian will support the revolution and will turn their back to Assad. That would happen in Egypt, because we know America supported Mubarak, but the moment 80 million or 28 million people were in the streets and they called for a change in one sound, in one unity, in one voice, that helped the Mubarak to go. We need to be united in Syria.
So do you think the force of there are those who argue it, including UN envoys, that the outside powers have sufficient clout to in effect push Syrians on both sides to the table, and that the Syrians once there will negotiate seriously.
Yes, because
and
they-
not return to the
I
battlefield.
mean, we are speaking here about talks in very cloudy way. Okay, Geneva 2 will be in August and September. We don't see anything on the ground. Let's have Syria deserves a leap of faith from the West to send a solid negotiation group that go to Assad to tell him what does he want, what the Alawite wants. If the Alawite are secure enough that the Sunnis will not attack them after Assad falls, they will turn their back to Assad. And I think that's very important. I think people always talk about arm and about fighting. And you know, I mean, psychologically, when you speak about arming and killing and fighting, people become more defensive. But when you open channel of communication between people and ask them really, what do you want? What Assad wants? What the opposition wants? What Idris wants? He wants arms. Then he will achieve what to the Syrians? We as Syrians, I think, we want peace, we want security, we want our families to go back to their homes, we want our grandmother to live where she likes and you know, to homeland. And I think that should happen before Geneva 2. But I see the failure of Geneva 2 if we jump into Geneva 2 without a negotiation delegation before Geneva 2.
A lot to think about. Any questions? Yes, well, you're the man. I wanted to ask you a question because you're the one man who thinks that the balanced initiatives of the opposition now.
My name is Muhammad Hussein. I'm from Syria. I came just from Aleppo. And I see that's how you are speaking about Syria, and you are forgetting the basic points that Syrian people want freedom in the first place, and the person who should be blamed is the government, is Bashar al-Assad himself. I worked for Syrian news agency 2 years during the revolution, and I know how they think. They think we don't collapse, and if we collapse above the corpus of our enemies. When I asked them, who is your enemies? They said those who are Sunnis. And they were coming to the news agency with a Kalashnikov. And then I left after that. So the problem, if everyone speaks in the name of the Syrians, and we are as the Syrians, or this and plural, we are not. We have different hopes. We have different dreams. And I agree with the Syrian speaker that we are still in a tribe situation. We are not a state. And what we have in Syria exactly, we have a mafia. We have a gang that's controlling the country. And now there is another gangs who are fighting with them. And absolutely, we don't want war. We want peace. But the outside world is completely, every time they are missing the points. In the start of the revolution, all people and all media, they were saying Damascus and Aleppo is with the regime. And I am from Aleppo, and I was telling everyone, Aleppo is not with the regime. In 2000, when Hafez al-Assad died, Syrian people were very happy, and I was one of them. But people don't understand it. We are very complex because we don't have a model or a way of thinking. We are completely lost. We were under repression for 40 years, and now we are paying the price for it. And personally, I am happy with what's going on because we will pay the price sooner or later because we are not in a good situation. We are in a bad situation. Some fault we should fix since the moments that the military and the soldiers came and took the power in the 70s. Thank you.
Well, we're glad to see you safe here. But now that you sit in London and have some time to reflect, what do you think the world, even just Britain, should do to help Syria in its plight, or should it do anything?
The problem here in UK, there is one way. I see the government is with the Syrian people and want to find a solution. But every time I watch BBC and I ask my British friends, what do you think? They told me we shouldn't do anything because they are just two sides are fighting each other. And when I tell them, how do you know we are fighting each other? They say, yeah, I saw this on BBC. I say, okay, but BBC sometimes broadcasts different information, and some information is true. And they say to me, whenever you read an article, in the end you find we couldn't verify this information. And that's mean for me as a British, this is all lies, don't care, just keep going.
Well, in defense of the BBC, we do try to cover all sides. Only God is perfect, as we say in the Middle East, but we do try.
Yeah.
I just want to say, just want to say something. What in order to end, what we have to think about the Assyrian is how to end what's going on. We know that whatever the regime is criminal. We know that the opposition has atrocities, and they stole the aspiration of us as a generation. But if we need to be united now, Sunni, Shi'i, Kurds, Alawite, and as you know that we need to not think tit for tat. If they are mafia, we can't be mafia. If they killed us, we don't kill them us back. And I want to remind you of the Prophet Muhammad, and you are Sunni, and you
I
know
don't believe in
that-
all religious
anyway,
rhetoric.
in Islam, I mean, like for the Sunni people, when he was killed and he left, when his tribes were killed and he left Mecca, when he came back to Mecca, he didn't kill anyone. He didn't take revenge. And you know, in religion, we don't take revenge in Islam. And that's why we need to be united and forget about our own personal problems with the regime in order for Syria, for the future of Syria, to come back to Syria and to build Syria. And what I want to say is that Geneva II and dialogue and negotiation is the only way which will help us as Syrians to have civil society. Otherwise, we will be ruled by military or by the jihadists or by arms, and we want to rule by civil society that protect us as Syrians.
Yeah, well, we do want Syria to get back to something that could be called normal, but thank you for that, and thank you very much.
Yes, hi, thanks. Mark Kirsten from the London School of Economics. I have a question about the relationship between comments made regarding stalemate. I have two questions, actually, very brief, I promise. The relationship between stalemate and negotiations, because it's often said that stalemates are conducive to negotiations so long as they're mutually hurting, right? That both parties have no better alternative than a negotiated agreement. So continuing war is worse than entering a potential peace process. And I wonder if there's an argument to be made, and I think it was slightly made actually, that international intervention should push, given that there is some stalemate, but it might be more stagnation than stalemate, to push it towards being mutually hurting, that both sides understand the limitations of a military engagement and the impossibility of a military solution. And then second, I have the question about the potential for international criminal justice and whether Syria is the limits of international criminal justice in a sense. Of course, the UN Security Council would have to refer a situation to Syria, and we know that there are certain barriers. But I wonder if it did occur, whether the panelists view it as a potentially helpful mechanism or not, given that it's generally accepted that both sides, rather than only one side, has quite clearly committed significant atrocities, which could at least foreseeably be found under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Thanks.
Is that for your PhD thesis? Very
Yes.
good questions. Actually, they go right to the heart of. I take one for Vaughan.
Yes, Anthony explained that there might be some benefits in providing additional weaponry for certain selected groups. What I haven't heard from the panel, I'm interested, do they see another way? I mean, clearly you've set the idea to us that much of the problem is from the outside, non-indigenous, be it religious or various political actors who don't actually come from Syria contributing to the problem. Do the panel see a route forward where we actually do the opposite, where we attempt to pull out the other players and perhaps reduce the arms going into the country? Could that improve it?
That's a good point. But I think we've had enough comments. Sadly, it's not just factors from outside. And sadly, it's a growing sectarian conflict inside Syria with so much blood having been shed and people being torn apart. One last question, then we're going to come back to the panel. This gentleman. 1 second, we'll wait for the microphone.
Could I just ask about the progress you mentioned, or process of secular opposition people becoming increasingly regarding themselves as Salafists? That seemed to have a lot of. You seem to disagree strongly with that, and I'd be interested for some of the other panelists if that's a process you've seen or you recognise.
See, you want to get back to the arguments. Always happens. This concept of mutually hurting is quite interesting because, of course, the rebels would say we're hurting far more because of the preponderance of military might in the hands of the government, and they haven't reached that situation. But do you want to take on that question?
Both sides are hurting. It's not just this looks at this in terms of sort of dead and wounded, but sort of Damascus, nobody has jobs. People can't afford their houses. The price of food is right up. That people can't get educated. People can't get out of the country. I mean, their life is increasingly a misery. So both sides are hurting. I think that there's another point you mentioned which is slightly different, but I think it is very important that neither side should believe that they're going to win a complete victory. That's one of the things that keeps it going. It's not really the level of hurt, I think.
Are they there?
Not yet, because that's one of the dangers of supplying some weapons, which don't make much difference, but tempt the opposition to think, hang on a bit longer, and we can have an all-out foreign intervention like Iraq. The government thinks, their allies have stuck with them, that the opposition are sort of discrediting themselves. We might win this yet. It's sort of a realization like you had in Northern Ireland here, when both sides, however much they disliked each other, realized they weren't going to win 100% victory or even an 80% victory, and they basically had to deal. That's kind of what you need there. And you'll get that, well, one way of going out, you do need, so many outside powers are involved that you have to have the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians, and one of the reason we're not having Geneva II is the Americans don't want to have the Iranians turning up, because that complicates their confrontation with Iran over nuclear weapons and other things. They don't want to recognize Iran as a regional power, effectively. But Iranians are major players. You don't have them, you can't really have negotiations. So, yeah, there are pressures from outside that could begin to bring this about, because one of the good things about an all-out conflict is you can't stage it without serious foreign backers. And if you have serious foreign backers, they have influence. So there are things that could be done there. But I think that, in a way, neither in Moscow nor in Washington nor in London have they the mood for making concessions is also pretty low. We've been talking about the lack of mood for concessions in Syria, but actually the mood for making concessions here is also pretty limited.
Anthony, do you want to either the criminal court or
I want to say a couple
of
of things. First of all, there are a lot of people at pains to sort of strike a balance of equivalence between the regime and the rebels are pretty capable of some revolting things, as we know. But let's not forget who started slaughtering unarmed protesters. And I say that as a way of just reflecting back on what initially people wanted in Syria. Now, they wanted different things, for sure, but it started off as waves of unarmed protests, which loosely were catalysed by the detention and torture of 15 children by the regime in Deraa. And the FSA didn't really come on the scene until a few months later. And I say that because it is important. Culpability on some level is important, and the actions of a state that chooses to slaughter its own people en masse makes it a fair degree worse than the actions of lone individuals or groups. I want to go on quickly to justice. I'll just tell an anecdotal story. When I was there, a particularly revolting video emerged of a Chechen foreign fighter cutting the heads off two men. There were 3 prisoners he had, and 2 had their heads cut off by him with a fairly short and blunt knife. And he was a Chechen jihadi out of your nightmares. He was sort of bald on top, long hair down to his waist on the sides, and a beard down to his knee. He'd obviously done it quite a bit before. He was handling the guys like a sort of butcher, handling livestock as he did it. It came very quickly out from the regime and was picked up by a lot of the British press, I think including the BBC. Christian bishop and another Christian too. There were no names. It was very difficult to prove this one way or another. By chance, when I was in Aleppo, I met an investigator for the Sharia courts, and we were talking about Islam, the way it's all going, and I said, hey, check out this video. Is this really the way you want things to go? And he said, oh yeah, that Chechen, his name's Al-Banout. We hauled him in and I interrogated him over this crime. And I was like, oh really? So were they Christians? And he said, oh no, they were Shabiha. And so I said, well, does that make it all right then? And he said, well, the manner of execution doesn't make it all right, but killing Shabiha is fine. So that was just one little anecdotal thing I saw on Syrian justice at the moment. The last thing I want to say on Salafists is interesting. There's a great degree of spite going on at the moment, which is very normal in a war. But yes, I've met loads of young guys repeatedly over the trajectory of 2 years who now are taking on a very Salafist bent just because they see, I mean, it's not defined Salafist Wahhabi as you might literally interpret it, but it's fundamentalist fundamentalist Sunni, conservative, who places a lot of their hopes in God as well as their faiths in God, by the nature of feeling rejected by all the other options that might be out there. It's something I've noticed repeatedly. In speaking to them, I say, why are you leaving the FSA and going to join an Islamist brigade? And they're like, well, first of all, spite, to stick it to the outside world. You didn't help us in our hour of need, so now we're turning to people who are. I think it's a common phenomenon.
I do not agree with that because Syrian as a society are very moderate Muslims, and after the 80s, what happened in Hama with the Muslim Brotherhood, there was Syria wears Islam very lightly because Hafiz Assad and Bashar Assad were very strict on people in Syria on the way they manifest Islam. In a way, we have very few people who wear burqa and niqab. We have very few people who can actually have beard. While we have more Sufism, and that's why we have like al-Bouti and al-Qubaysiyat as a strong religion characteristic or specification of Syria. Post September 11, there was a rise of very Islamic leaders. We don't have actually in Middle East like here we have icons of social leaders or political leaders, or even we have more Islamic leaders who appeared into the scene post September 11, like and preachers, Islamic preachers, and they were a lot of rise in Islamic channels, which give a platform to these Islamic scholars like Al-Arifi, like Qaradawi. We have Hassan Nasrallah because he becomes a leader who anyway influenced many young people and lead them to his party, because there was this rise of what we call Islamic Renaissance. And then this Islamic rise was starting to be politicalized during the Arab Spring under the influence of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the financial support of the rise of
Did you see that in Syria in recent years? We see more women wearing hijab.
Yes, I see that after Bashar came to power in 2010, there was ban of niqab in Syria, and then they revolt against that during the Arab Syrian revolution, and that's why women wears more niqab. Before 2000, we have very few numbers of Syrian women wearing niqab. I want to go back to Salafism as an exported ideology from Saudi to Syria. And it grows because of the presence of the Salafi jihadists in Syria. Not because Syrian people, they feel, disappointed and they will go to Salafism, or because the Salafism has arm or they disappointed in the regime. No, it's because of the money that Saudi Arabia is spending on exporting and sending jihadists to Syria, and Qatar, the same thing, on sending all these arms to rise the...
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree on that one. I wonder what you think as a Syrian, though. The question raised about the International Criminal Court, there is already the suggestion, and dossiers are being prepared about war crimes prosecution, which would have to first be referred to the Security Council. As a Syrian, would you like it to be resolved in those courts? We see the battle in Libya going on now as to who will try the people who are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. What would you...
I am aware of a secret committee that has been sent to Syria that is actually counting and investigating the crimes have done by the regime. And I hope this committee...
both sides.
The atrocity of the opposition. And we need to see both sides, even Bashar Assad, if he did, and his war crime, he should be taken to international court. And he should be... all leaders from Ba'ath Party, or people who committed atrocities, we want to see them in international court. That's the way we can move Syria to democracy. Otherwise, I think the revolution will fail.
Okay. Just one last question, because Vaughan had mentioned, and it was sort of along the lines that you were talking about, James, about actually pulling back and letting Syrians try to resolve their issues rather than the more foreign intervention. Do you want to make a comment on this?
It's rather easier said than done, of course. I mean, can I just very briefly say, not that I want to talk about, there's a very good book called Salafis and Heavy Metal Culture, which points out the distinction between Salafi and Salafist violence. Salafis are often a part of a sort of youth culture, a bit like Goths, and we're really in danger of saying that everything is a foreign dupe. These are Syrians, you know, we're talking about. I'm skeptical of sort of international initiatives which purport to change the incentives faced by warring parties, because generally what happens then, and it's happened again and again, you can see it happened in Homs in November 2011 when I was there, it's happened lots of times since, is that when you draw arbitrary lines in the sand and change the incentives faced by warring parties, people simply game the incentives. That's why you have loads of journalists running around looking for chemical weapons. Well, most Syrians aren't afraid of chemical weapons because it appears to be an exotic, rather glamorous way to die, given that you can be killed with a bullet or a bomb or anything else. So what you have is this sort of shadow boxing as people try and game the incentives, and that creates further barriers and pulls Syrians apart. So I think that's a real danger. The last thing I want to say is actually agreeing with Hala, is that it would be really lovely, if all of these countries which were supporting the Syrian military revolt would hand out visas, because let's remember how this revolution started. It had very little to do with Alawis. It had a great deal to do with corruption, with economic problems, and with a demand for reform. So really, the young Syrians that I met, they all want visas, they're all engineers, they're very clever. What they wanted was to go abroad, and many of these Gulf countries, which belatedly supported an armed revolt, weren't giving them visas, and certainly the West aren't giving them any visas now because we all think they're Al-Qaeda. So I think that's a real problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I speak for all of us that no matter where we stand in this war, no matter where we think it's going to go or should go, that it pains all of us, and it pains us most of all for Syrians, that what is happening to an absolutely extraordinary country with an extraordinary people. And I think all of us here, if we had the power to stop the war, we would do it. But unfortunately, as we speak, men and women with guns on both sides are charting the course of the war in Syria and in the countries around it, and men and women in capitals around the world are also thinking about how to move this crisis forward, to try to perhaps end on searching for an optimistic note of any kind. And I know we've got the predictions horribly wrong, but why not try again and get them wrong again? Is I'll leave all of us to say that if we met here again at the Frontline Club in a year, do you think there's any chance that at this time next year the two sides will have finally come to the negotiating table?
I hope so.
Hope is not a strategy. Do you think so?
I have faith in that to be solved, but I can't be sure.
No, I think that the lack of clarity and cohesion over what is to be done will leave it to free fall into the mid-distance.
I think it's looking more and more like the Lebanese civil war, which lasted 15 years. There are too many players involved. I mean, at some point this happened, but by next year, I doubt it. It's just it's too close. There's too big a mosaic of people involved, too many conflicting interests.
I think if you're looking for a sort of geopolitical hope, it might be that the countries which have been stoking this, the Gulf countries, Iran and Russia, might realize that they've given rise to this sort of demon that they can't control, and they might sort of retrench and try and change their approach.
I always used to fall back on that great Cold War expression by the Italian Marxist Gramsci, which is the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect. And then some time ago I decided that was so yesterday. And so I now fall back on Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who always says in his most evocative way that in the end, it's not a question of optimism or pessimism, that we are all prisoners of hope. So let us go out into the brilliant London evening and the summer sun and the end of the summer evening with a bit of hope for Syria. Thank you very much for joining us.